Okay, give me just a second. And good morning this time. Well, today's show is going to be about giant robots. And by giant robots, I don't mean your usual, just, Transformers or whatever. These are piloted giant robots, or Mecha. And yes, we're going to be talking about games with Mecha. No, Carlton. But we're not going to be talking about games with Mecha. We're going to be talking about games where Mecha were the primary focus. Where the whole point of the game is to play either a pilot or mechanic or someone involved in giant robots beating the stuffing out of each other. Now, probably one of the first games like this was Battletech. Came out in 1984. However, at that point, it was a war game. And yes, the war game side of Battletech pretty much dominated until... Carlton! No. No. Pretty much dominated. Thank you. Until the video games really got popular. The MechWarrior series of games. Well, MechWarrior, as a tabletop role-playing game, came out in 1986, after several of these other games we're going to talk about, or at least a few of them. The next major game to come out was called Mechton. You probably haven't heard of it, but you might have. It's by Art Halsorian, the same company that made Cyberpunk. Everyone's getting revved up for Cyberpunk 2077 coming up next year. And it's set in the Art Halsorian Cyberpunk universe. Well, people also may not know that there's a new edition of that game coming out. So, it's a solid game that stood the test of time. Mechton, well, it kind of lasted till about the mid to late 90s. Sort of. But when it came out in 1984, it was a board game. Not a tabletop war game like Battletech. It was more of a board game. And then in 1985, they came up with role-playing rules for it. At the time, it was actually less detailed on the mech creation than Battletech. Battletech had more guns. It had a wider variety of sizes, of weight classes to choose from. Because you're going from 20 to 100 in steps of 5. Yeah, that's 17 different classes compared to the 10 classes for Mechton. However, in 1987, Mechton 2 came out, and one of the key features of this was they came up with a system for creating your mech from scratch. We're talking, you didn't have to choose a weight class and then I can fit this many weapons. I've got 2 slots for guns, and these are the guns you could build guns from scratch. You could build the mecha from scratch. You could build a control system. Did you want a pilot with, levers and buttons, or did you want a full Waldo system where as you move your arm, it moves the mech's arm, or even neurologically controlled? You sit there in the cockpit and your body is like in stasis, but you're becoming the mech. Any number of things. And that was the big selling point until it finally kind of faded from shelves in the late 90s. Now, the next one, there was an early game, very early game, called the Mechanoid Invasion. This was the first role-playing game by Palladium, a self-proclaimed arch-rival of TSR. But it doesn't really count because the mecha were effectively cyborgs, kind of like the Daleks, cyborg brains inside mechanical bodies, that were the enemy. And you were playing humans, not mecha pilots. However, 1986, Palladium got the license to produce a role-playing game for the Harmony Gold powerhouse called Robotech. They produced books for all three generations that could stand alone or mix, and then later on source books for the Sentinels, which is a time period after. A standalone role-playing game based on Macross 2, which the complex history of Macross is weird. Like, there's a movie for Macross called Do You Remember Love, which is in-universe the movie-based retelling of the entire Macross series. Macross 2 follows after Do You Remember Love, not the Macross TV show. So it's not canon. And then you've got... it's complex. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of those. They really haven't put out anything new in a very long time. And then in 1986 as well, the Hero system, which was used for Champions, and is still used for Champions, and is one of the longest-lasting systems there is, produced a book with a variant of their system called Robot Warriors. And Robot Warriors was, for all intents and purposes, giant robot superheroes fighting each other in a giant robot universe. Yes, it was Mecha, but it was using the superhero rules, which... Champions has a problem with scaling above a certain point. Anyway, and the last one we're going to talk about, because we're only going through the early to mid 80s, is a game called Living Steel. I saw Living Steel everywhere in hobby shops and game stores all over my town. I never saw a single human being play it. I never saw that copy of Living Steel budge from its position on the shelf at my friendly local game store, FLGS. So, I don't know how it was. I never played it. I never read through the book. I do know that it was an extremely complex system with all sorts of lookup tables and... Yeah, so I'm thinking that, 1987, the uber complex games were starting to be on the way out. That's around the time period that twerps came out to make fun of them. And, people were getting tired of, it's even more complex than Rollmaster. I don't know if it was, but simulationist games were getting more and more complex. They were going for complexity instead of realism. They thought it was synonymous. Anyway, that's the basic rundown on the games. Now, of these, I've played Battletech and Mech Warrior, although Mech Warrior, very, very brief time. Mechton I played for quite a while and even created several settings for it. And I played Robotech on more than one occasion. Now, the thing about Robotech is the books are still available because people use them as resources for playing Rifts. Because Rifts uses the mega damage system that Palladium created for Robotech. I've never played Robot Warriors, but I've played the Hero system. And I've not only never played Living Steel, I don't know anyone who has. I've never met anyone who has played Living Steel. Now, Battletech had a hiccup when FASA died. FASA was the game company that produced it, and it died around the turn of the millennium. It got bought up by WizKids, who for a while tried to turn it into a clicky-based game, which really, really didn't work. And so someone else bought the rights to the game from them, and a new edition is coming out now. There's also the legendary conflict between FASA, or whoever owns the rights at the current time, Harmony Gold, and Bandai over the rights to a series of mecha called the Unseen. When Battletech first came out under the name Battle Droids, very quickly changed the name to Battletech, there were a number of mecha, a large number, that were not original. They were at least the design for the physical appearance of them was based on mecha from Macross, an anime called Fang of the Sun Dugram, and in the case of the infamous and famous Locust, from an anime that's otherwise mostly not mecha called Crusher Joe. These mechs, eventually it got to the point where they couldn't use them. And so what they would do is they either just didn't include them, it would reference the names, or in the case of the Japanese version, a complete and utter redesign. Eventually they got nicknamed the Unseen, and more modern designs have come out that basically replace the original looks and kind of dodge around the whole copyright problem. Mekton. Mekton had a couple universal source books, of which at least one of them became its own game, or two of them. The first one, well, we'll get back to that one, because it got kind of popular for a while. Jovian Chronicles. The Jovian Chronicles was the solar system as the field of warfare. Each planetary colony being a different design philosophy, a different political system, and they're all at war with each other, and the player characters play members of one of the Jovian colonies, I think around Titan or Io. And it was very, very heavily inspired by the entire long-running, incredibly, unimaginably popular Gundam series. More so the earlier Gundam timelines, not so much from the mid-90s on. Mostly because from the mid-90s on it started to turn into super robots and less into mass production robots. The second setting ended up getting its own system and ended up becoming popular enough to get its own video game and its own sit-down arcade game. And that was Heavy Gear. Heavy Gear was almost Diesel Punk, but in the far future, and was heavily inspired, although not completely stolen from, but inspired by an anime called Armored Trooper Votoms. The mecha were small, only about 3 to 4 meters tall. They would crouch down, and the entire torso would open up, and you get in and slam it shut and start your diesel engine. Yeah, the mechs were powered by diesel engines. Anyway, that one eventually, grew large enough that it completely divorced itself from Mekton. Nowadays, there's a number of mecha games. You can play Battletech or Robotech or break out the old Mekton books, or you can play a lot of new games. I really haven't done a lot of research into the newer games because that's not the focus of this video. But there's also a lot of mecha video games out there. And really and truly, video games are where mecha shine. Because with complex systems like these things would have, it's a lot easier when the computer is controlling all of the data about them. You don't need to worry about, do you have enough fuel left in your lower left maneuver verniers? Or have you run out of ammo in your 14th gun? No, the computer keeps track of it all. So you've got, Mech Warrior has gotten huge. Like I said, DreamPod 9's Heavy Gear had several games. And then you've got all sorts of independent games. There's any number of them out there. So, if you want to be a giant robot and you want to be tearing cities apart and beating the stuffing out of other giant robots or even giant monsters, yeah, it was possible to do that in Mechton because it had rules for techno-organics or just organics that big. Well, there's plenty of games for you to choose from. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to log out, and I will see you all next time.